created a structure which disadvantaged indigenous groups and Afro-Latin Americans, and we're still living that legacy out. And they point to the fact that slavery ended throughout the 1800s in Latin America, but it only ended officially, formally in the region with the end of slavery in Brazil in 1888. Brazil was the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery, and Brazil is one of the acknowledged leaders in terms of being an unequal society, not only socially, but also racially. And so the political battle that we have today, and again, it's been going on for 30 years, if not longer, has been what to do about this racial inequality, which black activists argue is intricately related to ongoing racial discrimination, but that other scholars and political leaders want to explain in terms of historical legacy or non-racial factors, right? Latin American leaders seem to be able to acknowledge widespread poverty in their societies more readily than they acknowledge widespread racism in their societies. And so, throughout Latin America, black leaders, black organizations, and black groups have been protesting, organizing, mobilizing members of their communities as well as members of the national community to do something about this depressed state that Afro-Latin Americans find themselves in. And I want to give you some examples of that to show you how complex the situation is. And I'll tend to focus my comments on the countries that have the largest number or percentage of blacks. For example, scholars estimate that Afro-Latin Americans, by that they generally mean blacks and browns, for the region as a whole, represent about a third of the Latin American population. So we're talking about 150 million people of African and visible African ancestry in Latin America. But that one-third isn't the case in every country. Some countries have larger black populations. Other countries have fewer blacks in them. So comments I make will be, we tend to focus on those countries that have larger black populations. Let's start with the country of Cuba. The Cuban Revolution triumphed over 50 years ago, 1959, and as a result of that revolution, racial segregation and racial discrimination was outlawed, was banned, was abolished, officially by Fidel Castro and the leadership of the revolution. Afro-Cubans supported that outlawing of segregation and discrimination, but they didn't support everything that the revolutionary leadership did. For example, the revolutionary government disbanded and made it illegal all political and social organizations not affiliated with the revolution. And so in Cuba, at the time of the revolution, there were over 100 social, cultural, and political groups that were Afro-Cuban. These are societies that Afro-Cubans used to congregate among themselves, to party, celebrate, but also to discuss issues of concern to the community, as well as express their interests. Those groups were banned. And Afro-Cubans protested. They said, we support the revolution, but it's not clear that outlawing segregation and racial discrimination is going to defeat them. In fact, you may ban them legally, but what about the attitudes and behaviors that may persist? And so there may be a need for Afro-Cubans to be able to organize to protest this, but the revolutionary government wasn't having it. And so, as a result, there were some conflicts between black Cubans and the revolutionary government, even though in terms of the egalitarian policies of the revolution, land reform, education reform, health reform, Afro-Cubans benefited from the revolution. But there's a prominent Afro-Cuban scholar named Carlos Moore who became the leading critic of the Cuban Revolution because he argued that the revolution was making a grave error by outlawing these black organizations and by going further than that, banning all discussion of racism. So Cuba kind of banned public discussion about racial discrimination and race in organizations. And so that made it even more difficult to raise the questions about black political organization and black political activity in Cuba. So that's kind of one extreme example where black political activity as such was banned in the name of the larger revolutionary project. In Brazil, you have a different scenario. Brazil had a military dictatorship from 1964 to 1985. This military dictatorship also banned discussion of racism in the society. But in the second half of the military dictatorship, especially the last 5 to 7 years, there was a transition to democracy. There was a gradual process leading towards civilian rule and democracy. And during that time, Afro-Brazilians were able to organize, protest racism, protest discrimination, and make their case to society as a whole, but also to political parties and elected officials and government entities. And so, interestingly, in Brazil, some political leaders, who at the time tended to be overwhelmingly white or light-skinned, some of these political leaders were receptive to the critiques by black activists, by Afro-Brazilian activists. And so in Brazil, starting in the early 80s, a process begins in which progressive political parties and more leftist political leaders tend to take the demands of black activists seriously. And so, for example, in major cities and some states throughout Brazil, black councils are created. And these are government entities which are dedicated to promoting racial equality and addressing the concerns of the black community. You had that in Sao Paulo, which is the largest state in Brazil. You had a similar phenomenon in Rio de Janeiro, which is the second largest state in Brazil. And so these government entities, these government units were routinely underfunded and understaffed, but they still had a presence. They still were able to raise the concerns